You're too young to be on that bridge. You're too young to be standing on the edge. Too young to be alone with the rain. You're too young. You just wanna be understood. You just wanna be guiltless if you could. Don't be ashamed, 'cause miscalculations are mislabeled as
Well, thank you so much for all your work. It has been inspiring. And I have 3 questions. The first one. Of course, freedom is a basic notion in your theory, but it is not enlisted in the 10 capabilities. It is because it's enclosed in practical reason, or because it is transversal to all of them?
Well, I would say that it really is in the notion of capability, because the capability is a freedom to choose. That's part of the definition of what a capability is. Now then, unlike Sen, I do not think that the goal should be to maximize freedom. And that's one of the big differences between me and Sen. I don't even think it's a coherent notion to maximize freedom, because some freedoms limit others. But I also think some freedoms are bad. They're freedoms to, let's say, denigrate other people or to discriminate on grounds of race and so. So the ones on the list are selected as being number 1, good, and number 2, important. Because there are a lot of things that are not so bad, but they're not very important either. And you wouldn't put in the Constitution the right of a motorcyclist to drive around without a helmet, even if you thought it was very good. It would be trivial. So the ones on the list are good and important, and the idea of freedom is included in what they are.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Carlos Lim from the UNAM, and I have a few questions. First, do you think to only proposing 10 capabilities, it's a restriction to the capabilities approach?
Well, you know, there's no magic to the number 10, and as time has gone on, I often tend to add new insights as a sub-specification of one of the ones that's already there, partly just because it's too difficult to keep having new lists and no one would keep track of it, but also because I actually think that each one of them is internally plural. That is, the development of senses, imagination, and thought includes lots of aspects: religious, associational, educational, and so on. And of course, a country that makes a constitution would probably be well advised to separate those. I mean, you would want an education right, you'd want a religious right, and so you would end up having more than 10, certainly. Sometimes I think of something new, like care, the importance of having care for yourself in times of disability, but also the importance that caregivers are treated with respect. And I guess I decided that wasn't going to be an extra one because it implicated so many of them. And so what caregivers and cared for people need is life, health, bodily integrity, and so it's a way of thinking about all of them. But how do people know that? If they only read the list, they wouldn't know that. They have to read the book.
Okay, and how the capabilities approach confronts the question of multiculturalism?
Well, that's what my lecture was about. So I think I won't repeat the lecture. Right? Did you hear the lecture?
Yeah. But
but I mean, then could you ask a more specific question that comes from the lecture?
Well, I would like to make another question.
I mean, a more specific question about multiculturalism.
Yeah.
During your conference here in Ibero, you affirmed that the importance of capability approach facing women's development and multiculturalism. But I would like to ask you about the relation of capability approach regarding the animal capabilities in relation to the establishment of a global justice issue.
Of animal capabilities. Well, I myself believe that the capabilities that we should be striving to protect include not just human capabilities, but the capabilities of all animals. all sentient animals. Now, there are these borderline cases that Aristotle called the stationary animals, like sponges. I'm not so interested in those, and I'm not really very interested in insects either, to tell you the truth. But sentience seems to me a basis for moral considerability. I think that's controversial within our association. I've noticed that there are really 5 different positions that people take. There are people who believe that only human capabilities should be count as intrinsically worthwhile, and then all the others would just be instruments of that. So out of that, you can still get quite a lot of robust environmental protection, because after all, environment is essential for human well-being. But a second one, which is what the list itself includes, is the idea that relationships with other species and the world of nature are intrinsically worthwhile. Now that, from the very first of my books, I had that idea. So therefore you see animals and nature coming in as relata, in relationships that have intrinsic value, not just as instruments of human well-being, but they're important only in those relations. So then the third position, which is the one I now hold and Frontiers of Justice develops, is the one where the capabilities of animals count on their own, not just in relation to humans. And then the fourth would be that you add to that plants and other living beings, that they would count as ends in themselves. I don't hold that view, but I want other people to develop it. I want to hear what they would say. Because to me, just in my imagination, sentience is very, very important. And I just don't understand the idea that a being who's not sentient is an end in itself. But, you know, I'm ready to listen to those arguments. And then the fifth would be, we give up the individualism, and we say, it's ecosystems that count. Now, I think ecosystems are important for humans and for animals, but I don't think they should be ends in themselves as opposed to the individuals in them, because I'm very suspicious that that would involve a hierarchy among the components, you know? I mean, it's like the family. The minute you recognize any organic entity as having value in itself, then it contains forms of subordination and hierarchy, and then you mask those. So I'm not in favor of the ecosystem approach, but I just want people to write about it, and I want to see what they say.
In relation to this question, should morals be considered as, should animals be considered as no human persons, as recently in India, banished dolphin spectacles because of that?
Well, you know, it's an approach, and I think in law you probably want to use any tool you have, but there are problems with it, I think, because it always ends up favoring the ones that are most like human beings and leaving others out. And I think that really what makes animals worthy of respect and concern is their own form of life, because it's them, not because it's like us. And so this extension was made usually to chimps or to dolphins, and we can imagine them as persons because they're so like us. If it were a proposal that all creatures would come under Article 21 of the Indian Constitution, that would be better. And actually, there was an older case in Kerala where circus animals were held to be persons in the meaning of Article 21. I'm happier with that just because it doesn't rest on this kind of anthropocentric conception of value. But, you know, in the end of the day, we just need to have new legal materials and new understandings. And my daughter right now is a law student, and she's studying the rights of animals, and this is what she's going to work on, and, you know, I think that's great, and it's just going to lead to new forms of public policy. Fortunately, she's in a state, namely Washington, where the state government is very interested in this kind of thing, and our federal government is not so interested.
My question is not related to your talk, but to your new book, Political Emotions. I found the proposal very interesting and very helpful to thinking that in Mexico City, well, in Mexico in general. I don't know if you know about the situation, the island situation, but what I found very interesting is the treatment of compassion in Chapter 9 and Chapter 6. There are some civil and social movements in Mexico that have been trying to propose the necessity that you are pointing there to value compassion and public emotions. But I see in your book that the proposal should come from not only from civil society but also from the government, and that we would need a sort of cohesion between the government and the society. But we have several difficulties with our government, because I am not sure that in our context they are able to pay attention to this kind of necessity. So what would you suggest for this kind of movements coming from civil society? How can we as part of the society participate in order to promote compassion and not to sound as sort of a naive proposal? So what should we do if we don't have the participation of our government in this kind of situation?
Well, see, the reason I didn't write about civil society was, first of all, it just wasn't my topic. I mean, my topic was, what can government do? But I think there's an inherent limitation of civil society, namely, it's not accountable to all the people, and it's not entrusted with the well-being of all the people. Most civil society organizations, even the best, favor certain kinds of people and not other kinds. So when, in our country, we had these faith-based initiatives where the government was going to channel certain money through religious organizations, it's clearly, I think, unconstitutional, only nobody wants to litigate it, because the criterion for getting that aid is partly your willingness to say you're interested in that religion. So anyhow, that is, I think, a problem, that a civil society organization has to be more careful than the government even, to show that it is truly inclusive of all people. Now, I think one thing you might think about is local government. A lot of things that I talk about in the book, as you know, are things that are not done at the national level, and there's quite a lot about my own city, because I think that in a city, you often have a sense of community and a sense of passion that it's harder to generate in a very large, diverse, spread apart country. On some issues, like the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, well, that had to be done at the national level. But when I talk about Millennium Park, you know, if you're going to build a park that will create a new relationship among people, oh, well, I have one, but I'll give you that one. A new relationship, then of course that's going to be done with the expectation that mostly the people in your city will be there. And that, so the civil society organizations were certainly very active in the lead up to Millennium Park. And they really wanted a park that would undo the elitist conception of parks that had come from the past, and it would suggest that Chicago is an inclusive city that generates sympathy for all, and then does it partly through grandeur and partly through humor and so on. Again, the part about, I don't know if you saw the part about Central Park in New York, that's similar, that there was a plan, and organizations were very active in the lead up to that, and succeeded in getting this piece of land set aside because they wanted workers to have rest. So I would say that's often, if you just have the ear of some powerful mayor who wants to do something, that can often happen very rapidly. And in our case, we've always had very powerful mayors, and so if you can convince the mayor that this is good for the city, then it can happen. Well, we have these book clubs, too, that I talk about, where people just come together and they read some novel about racial problems in Chicago, and that can be organized by a city, but you couldn't have an America-wide book club reading To Kill a Mockingbird or something. So I would say focus maybe at that level first and see if you can accomplish something there, and then see what happens after that.
I was just hoping you could say a little bit more on the relationship between economics and philosophy. So I was wondering, how exactly do you understand the relationship or the dialogue that happens, or that should happen at least, between them? Is it that they are like two different sciences with their specific methods, etc., that happen to work on the same subject, and as such, they should, talk and say, well, I found this and you found this and what should we do about it? Or is it that, historically, as you said, like, economics came from philosophy, but could we still say that, no matter how mathematical the economical method might become, it still somehow, to some extent, it depends on philosophical, at least, presumptions, even when economists might fail to see this. Maybe very, very thin conceptions of human nature or society or whatever, but they still depend on this. And as such, economics could not even move on without having these philosophical assumptions.
Well, yeah, it's that latter way that I see it. That is that insofar as economics is just purely predictive, you might say it can go its own way and it's a science. But even when it's purely positive and not normative, it's already focusing on some things as important and leaving other things out. So there's an inherent normativity even in the choice of things to focus on. But then, of course, it almost always is normative. Development is a normative concept. And that's how Sen and I got our project started, because there was this conference on development as a normative concept for which we wrote a co-authored paper. And then we thought, oh, well, this is a huge topic. We really need to do it thoroughly and bring a bunch of philosophers together. Now, Sen is both. He's trained in both philosophy and economics. And so the great thing is that he has the mathematical sophistication, but therefore he wins credibility with the other economists. And then he can point out to them the inherent philosophical shortcomings of what they do. I could never have gotten anyone's ear. And even Sen, for a long time, he was considered for the Nobel Prize and didn't get it because the head of the Nobel Committee kept going around saying, Sen is now doing philosophy, not economics. As though, these foundational things were not part of the discipline. Well, it's very hard, because if a young person wants to make a career in economics, they had better not do this sort of thing. And we kept thinking, whom shall we invite to our meetings? And, which economists will join us? And we found that, Jean Drèze, of course, but he's really a co-author with Sen. And then there are a couple others, like John Romer, who's really, but see, Romer is no longer in the economics department. He's in the political science department, because the economists just didn't take that part of his work seriously. So it's very hard to get economists to really take seriously serious philosophical work. Now, you can, up to a point, you can kind of get them to pay lip service to it. And I have a good working relationship in terms of our economics department with James Heckman, who was the Nobel Prize winner in 2000, who works on childhood education, because we both care about that issue, and I respect his work, and he uses a notion of capability that's not, I put it in the appendix to my book to explain the differences between the two, because I think that our people should know much more about Heckman's work. And we had a conference together about capabilities in education, where I prevailed on him to let me have a whole session where philosophers would talk about the goals of education. And, we're doing it again. And we have a plan in the opening of our university's research center in Delhi. Heckman and I are having an exchange along with Jean Drèze about children and capability. But I don't think that he really reads my work. I probably don't. I read his work except for the extremely mathematical parts, but he writes quite a lot for a general audience. So I think it's a limited partnership. And I just don't know what to do about it. I think it's very, very difficult. I think with the law and economics people, I know what to do, but they just are not that mathematical. And so I co-teach, I sit in on every workshop they give, I read the paper, I ask them questions, So I establish my cred by just being there. And it's the politics of presence, really. I think that if you have a community where philosophers can, have a chance to be present, and they really are, and they ask good questions, that's important. And I probably would go to the rational choice workshop too, except I just can't go to everything. So, that's, I think some economists would be more persuaded if they saw you more often, listened to you. But it's very difficult, and I think one just has to keep working on it. Even in our association, we've had meetings where there's good kowtowing to the Nobel Prize and so on. And to get a philosopher chosen as now we've had 5 presidents, now the 6th president is going to be a philosopher, and it's the first one since me. And I really had to kick and scream in order to get them to do that. And, you know, say things like, well, this association is no longer fulfilling its goals, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, it also had to find somebody who had enough presence, because he had edited the journal and he had put in a lot of time in the association, that they knew who he was, because philosophy is not international to the same extent that economics is. And so Henry Richardson, who is the incoming president, he's not a household word in India, the way that some equally competent economist would be, and he might not be a household word in Mexico. I don't know whether he is. But anyway, he was known to be Buddhist because he worked in the association.
Two questions, hopefully you can answer both. One is very general, but it could be useful for us. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between love, friendship, compassion?
It's
generally, that's it. And,
okay.
The second, and let me state the second one to see if you have time to answer it.
Yeah.
Do you think that every reasonable idea of dignity can be explained with your 10 capabilities?
Can be framed with it?
Frame, yeah, let's say frame, or explain, or reduce, or substitute.
Now, let me answer that one. As I said in the talk, I don't think the notion of dignity does much conceptual work on its own. And it's only in thinking about how, I think it has some content, but the content is very thin and very vague. So what I don't like are debates in bioethics where people just say, oh, that goes against human dignity, as if that's a debate stopper. You know, we don't have to talk anymore. I think if you see a whole family of political principles, and you can consider it as a whole, and use as a working tool this thin notion of dignity, meaning treating as an end and not a means, and then you think, basically, well, how do various forms of treatment exemplify that? Well, I tried to do that in framing the list. Now, of course, it's not the only place in the human life where notions of dignity become important. It just happens to be some core political principles. But I do think that in thinking about, for example, that first woman's question at the talk about aging and disability, it's a very important help in framing it. When you think about what employment policies shall we have toward people as they age, one thought is, how does it impact the treatment of them as people of equal dignity? To allow a person who's perfectly competent and enjoying their work to go on working seems to me a pretty important way of respecting their human dignity. And I would certainly feel highly disrespected did I live, as many of my friends unfortunately do, in countries that just say, bye-bye to you, you're 65, go away, and sit around and eat cereal or something. So anyway, love, friendship, and compassion. I think friendship and love are very closely intertwined, of course, because I personally favor a form of love in which friendship is a large component, and I think love is very unstable if friendship isn't a large component. But there are, love is often usually defined in terms of a passionate longing and a sense of the indispensability of the object. Friendship is defined more by reciprocity. I think in it, if you have a love that's not reciprocal, that's likely to be highly unstable and to be productive of great unhappiness. But there can be, I guess, more asymmetrical forms of love, like between parents and children, that don't, at least initially, involve much reciprocity. So that's a complicated question, but they overlap to a great degree. Now, in thinking about compassion, compassion focuses on another person's bad situation. So it's not complete, because you want a good way of relating to people when they're happy and doing well and so on. So you want forms of emotional relation that are more inclusive than compassion. And I think, too, that compassion can be pretty thin and distant. So I could say, oh, I have great compassion with those people over in some other part of the world who just had a flood, or let's say people in the Philippines. I don't know them. I don't really relate to them. Whereas I think love the reason I wanted love in my book is that it's more personal. It's more what I call eudaimonistic. You feel your own well-being is implicated here. And what I think nations need to do is make their citizens not just have this tepid attitude, well, too bad if the poor people are suffering, but something much more passionate, like part of who we are involves doing something about their suffering. And this is why I think you need forms of symbolic attachment to the nation, its history, its geography, and so on. You need to be able to deploy that in order to get people to move beyond thin compassion into something that really leads to action. So, of course, compassion itself can do that, but I think it doesn't always do that. Yeah.
All through your work, you have pointed out the gender gaps in development. In your opinion, as we are approaching to the new development goals, which should be the next feminist agenda, which are the main problems we should focus on?
Well, of course, different countries will have different priorities, because there are some countries where, let's say, getting women to a level of literacy is just not an issue. And there are a lot of countries now where the educational attainment of women is rapidly outstripping that of men, and what we seem to need to worry about is what's happening to men, and why are they doing so badly in secondary education. Because all of the universities in my country have affirmative action now for men, pretty much, because otherwise they'd be 75% female, according to just the grades and the scores. So I think, anyway, so the education thing varies a lot from country to country. And in many, many countries we still have to worry about lack of educational access for women. Employment, again, it varies a lot. I think here, in the developed countries anyway, it's now the glass ceiling issue, and the fact that women can get initial access and they get professional training, but why is it that they don't get up to the next level? And I think this is involved, what this will require is thinking much better about family support, about how to support women in their childbearing years so that they don't leave the workplace and they're not thought of as second-class workers, and they're not expected to be super women either. And I mean, I was very lucky in my own experience because I had a lot of support for childcare. Universities are usually pretty good on that, and they're benign workplaces. And by now, I would say even the men in our law school who want to do childcare are not ashamed of that, and they can mention that. And so I think universities move along, but law firms. Here I'm sending my students from my feminist philosophy class out into a world where they just can't do anything. All that they learn from me, they can't change how law firms operate, and they operate in a way that strongly disadvantages women past the entry level. Now we know that at the entry level women are doing very well, but then we look at the partner level and they don't do so well. And it's all about family, really, and time, and that's true in medicine, it's true in politics. I don't know if you saw an article by Anne-Marie Slaughter in Harper's Magazine. She's a political theorist at Princeton, but she went to work in the State Department, a very powerful position, and then she found that it was just unworkable in terms of her family commitments, and so she wrote an article saying why women can't have it all, and the answer was we just have very bad public policies in matters of family support. So that's another area. But you know, the one that I would put first of all, I suppose, is really sexual violence, sexual harassment, because all countries have it, and have it, I guess, in roughly equal measure as far as we can possibly tell. When this gang rape case came up in India, some people, including the Kennedy School at Harvard, made themselves ridiculous by saying, we want to advise developing countries on the problems of sexual violence that your people face. Wow, every campus in the US is a crime scene, and that's just the fact. And I think ours is a little less than some because we have no big money sports and almost no fraternities. There are some campuses like Bowdoin College which have no fraternities and no big time sport. And they really don't seem to have this problem so much because it's related to drinking, but it's also related to the drinking that is particularly constructed around athletics and fraternity culture and so on. So anyhow, we have this horrible problem. I would say I'd rather send a child of mine to be an undergraduate in India than in the US in terms of the safety, because a lot of Indian students live at home and they don't have the opportunity to have these rape parties, which are so common on American campuses. Sexual harassment is another one. And if you read some of the blogs in philosophy, the Colin McGinn case and all the discussions of sexual harassment in philosophy, well, the thing is that case is the tip of an iceberg, because there's just a lot of sexual harassment that is not reported, because people are intimidated, because they don't want their whole life to be revolving around the litigation that they might not win, because men still hold the power and they just don't want to lose their career. And so there are many cases of sexual harassment that are known to have occurred, and people who are known to have done it, where nothing happens to them, and they go on happily through their career for many years. You can even be fired for sexual harassment and then pop up some other place and do it all over again, because often when you're fired there's some secrecy agreement and so on. And yeah, so I mean, this goes back a long way. Now, what has happened is all universities have policies now, and we know what sexual harassment is and what it isn't. So we know that it would be per se wrong to have a sexual relationship with somebody that you're supervising in a philosophy program, whether it's an undergraduate you're teaching or a graduate student you're supervising, and that's a deterrent. So people of goodwill will be deterred, and that is not nothing. A lot of people are probably deterred by that, but then it's the bad apples are not deterred, and then they get away with it. So I think, what can happen? As I said in the talk, I think just more women in positions of power, because then there's more willingness to speak out, and there's more uncovering of the stuff that's actually happened, and I do welcome the fact that more and more women are presidents of colleges and universities.
It's a very brief question related to what you were explaining about compassion. Is it related to the idea of recognition that Charles Taylor has used? I mean, compassion as a moral commitment, or you were saying it's something more than friendship. It's a sort of moral link, moral relation to
well, I don't think compassion is always moral. Okay. I define compassion, and you know this because you read the book, but I'll just explain it, as involving, and this is really already in Aristotle, three essential thoughts. The thought that the other person's predicament is serious, the thought that they didn't primarily bring it on themselves, and the thought that it's an relatively important part of your well-being. That's what I call the eudaimonistic thought. Often, you also want to add what Aristotle adds, that is the thought of similar possibilities, that you're vulnerable in similar ways. But I argue that that's not necessary. Okay, so it has some eudaimonistic element, but that can be either thicker or thinner, depending on how far away you are and all of that. So that was what I was saying to him. But you see, as I defined it, it's not moral, because you might just have compassion for only members of your own family, and you might think, well, those are the only ones whose well-being matters to me, and then I would say that's almost anti-moral. Many people, of course. Now, Paul Bloom, this Yale psychologist whose new book, Just Babies, I highly recommend, he shows that babies have an inherent sense of fairness. They also have an inherent capacity for compassion, but they're not very well linked, because the compassion develops primarily around the familiar. And people all through the world like what they know, and they don't like what they don't know. And so insofar as they have also a sense of fairness, they're able to move out beyond them. But that would be the task of education. And so, but then to talk about even a quite moralized compassion can be tricky and unreliable, because it's often triggered by vivid stories. So, to mention another psychologist I admire, Dan Batson, who wrote this great book, Altruism in Humans, what he shows in some of his experiments is that if you know what the fair process is to allocate scarce organs, and then you hear, when you agree, this is the fair way to do it, then out of the 10 people on the list, they tell you the life story of one of them. This woman, has this disease, and she lost her boyfriend just now, and her mother died last year. And with all this vivid story, people feel much more for that woman, and they want to move her to the top of the list, even though they have already accepted a moral principle that says that she doesn't belong at the top of the list. So this is how it could, even the more moralized compassion, which is all about helping people who need help, it can still be led astray, and so not quite reliable. That's why I think that we want to use it publicly only within the context of good laws and institutions.
I have another question. In your book, The Frontiers of Justice, you said that industrialized nations must be involved in supporting other peoples of nations. How you conserve this duty of justice as an historical debt or environmental debt?
Wait, how do I, sorry, I didn't quite get the last part. How do I consider this duty on the historical level?
Of justice as an historical debt or environmental debt?
Well, I don't think it's either. I mean, I was talking primarily about supporting human capabilities. I think there are environmental issues we could talk about as well, but I was talking primarily about supporting the capabilities of human beings, part of which might come from environmental assistance, but there are a lot of other things, medical assistance and just general financial assistance. I think some people do frame it as a historical debt, meaning we in the West are guilty of damaging them through colonial oppression and we should pay back. That a lot of that is true, but I think that that's not the reason you should do it. The reason you should do it is that you're a member of a world in which some people have very unequal life chances, and you should be promoting human well-being. And so I think using the payback argument is not necessary, and it's probably a little bit, it leads to bad results because it means that, poor people in India will get help, and poor people in New Zealand will not get help. Or, people who were never colonized will not get the kind of help that they need. And, the U.S. didn't colonize India, so maybe the U.S. shouldn't help India. So it's that kind of thing. I think it's good to notice that. Good to notice that wrong was done. And it should diminish our arrogance and perhaps enhance our general sense of global responsibility, but it shouldn't be the primary reason you give the aid.
Okay, so now we're running out of time.
One more,
maybe one
if I
question.
can. You were asking in the conference how to improve the woman's situation in a country like ours that we face corruption and so on. And you said that more women in power would be best. But how would we fight corruption in general? Do you have any kind of...
Well, as I said several things in answer to him. I said good police education was important. Of course, corruption is in many different places. And I think how you fight corruption in the police is different from how you fight it in, let's say, the Internal Revenue Service or something. I do think that popular anti-corruption movements, such as the one in India, have great power to really draw attention to that issue. And I think in India, it was about time that would happen, because the major parties were just not doing anything. Manmohan Singh, when he took office in 2004, he said, my major commitment will be to eradicate corruption, but then he just didn't do anything. So I think that it was about time for a protest movement, and let's hope it does do some good. But I think often you can, by just approaching it piece by piece, you can make a lot of progress. Why is it that in the United States the Internal Revenue is not corrupt? Well, if you look at the way the penalties for doing things the wrong way and the kind of oversight that exists, much better oversight in the Internal Revenue than in the banking system, for example. So the kinds of oversight that work and that don't work. And I think in the case of the police, it was really an uprising from people, and together with the availability of the phone. I mean, now that people videotape their behavior of police, they see, I mean, even before the smartphone, it was the case in LA, the Rodney King incident. I guess it was just somebody who had a video camera, it just happened to be there. But anyhow, yeah, so now the police know that they can't get away with things because people will phone them. And so our state, even, they tried to make it illegal to video a police interaction, but that was quickly laughed at, and people thought that was ridiculous. So now Illinois has adopted a rule that even interrogation after you're arrested has to be videotaped. Because a lot of the innocence, you know, we have a thing called the Innocence Project that started in Illinois, but it operates in other states, that uses DNA evidence to acquit rapists and murderers and so on who were wrongly convicted. And there's so much of that and many of these people have confessed. So they know that something went wrong in the interrogation, and that they were intimidated and deprived of sleep or whatever. So now all interrogations have to be videotaped. And that is great progress. So I think that's special to police, but that's crucial. You couldn't deal with oversight of the police without that.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks a lot.
Guiltless if you could. Don't be ashamed, 'cause miscalculations on this label, there's nothing good. Oh, you're too young to be on that bridge. You're too young.
Right of a motorcyclist to drive around without a helmet, even if you thought it was very good, it would be trivial. So the ones on the list are good and important, and the idea of freedom is included in what they are.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Carlos Lim from the UNAM, and I have a few questions. First, do you think to only proposing 10 capabilities, it's a restriction to the capabilities approach?
Well, you know, there's no magic to the number 10, and as time has gone on, I often tend to add new insights as a sub-specification of one of the ones that's already there, partly just because it's too difficult to keep having new lists and no one would keep track of it, but also because I actually think that each one of them is internally plural. That is, the development of senses, imagination, and thought includes lots of aspects: religious, associational, educational, and so on. And
Well, I would like to make another question.
I mean, a more specific question about
Okay.
multiculturalism.
Yeah.
You know.
During your conference here in Ibero, you affirmed that the importance of capability approach facing women's development and multiculturalism. But I would like to ask you about the relation of capability approach regarding the animal capabilities in relation to the establishment of a global justice issue.
Of animal capabilities. Well, I myself believe that the capabilities that we should be striving to protect include not just human capabilities, but the capabilities of all animals, all sentient animals. Now, there are these borderline cases that Aristotle called the stationary animals, like sponges. I'm not so interested in those, and I'm not really very interested in insects either, to tell you the truth. But sentience seems to me a basis.
You're too young to be on that bridge. You're too young to be standing on the edge. Too young to be alone with the just wanna be guiltless if you could. Don't be ashamed, 'cause miscalculations are mislabeled as
Well, thank you so much for all your work. It has been inspiring. And I have 3 questions.
Of course, a country that makes a constitution would probably be well advised to separate those. I mean, you would want an education right, you'd want a religious right, and so you would end up having more than 10, certainly. Sometimes I think of something new, like care, the importance of having care for yourself in times of disability, but also the importance that caregivers are treated with respect. And I guess I decided that wasn't going to be an extra one because it implicated so many of them. And so what caregivers and cared for people need is life, health, bodily integrity, and so it's a way of thinking about all of them. But how do people know that? If they only read the list, they wouldn't know that. They have to read the book.
Okay, and how the capabilities approach confronts the question of multiculturalism?
Well, that's what my lecture was about. So I think I won't repeat the lecture, right? Did you hear the lecture?
Yeah. But
But I mean, then could you ask a more specific question that comes from the lecture?
The first one. Of course, freedom is a basic notion in your theory, but it is not enlisted in the 10 capabilities. It is because it's enclosed in practical reason, or because it is transversal to all of them?
Well, I would say that it really is in the notion of capability, because the capability is a freedom to choose. That's part of the definition of what a capability is. Now then, unlike Sen, I do not think that the goal should be to maximize freedom. And that's one of the big differences between me and Sen. I don't even think it's a coherent notion to maximize freedom, because some freedoms limit others, but I also think some freedoms are bad. They're freedoms to, let's say, denigrate other people or to discriminate on grounds of race and so the ones on the list are selected as being number 1, good, and number 2, important, because there are a lot of things that are not so bad, but they're not very important either, and you wouldn't put in the Constitution that